everybody. I'm here with Herbert Schwaab and Richard Grusin, professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee and director of the Center for 21st Century Studies. And he is the author of Remediation, Understanding New Media with J.D. Bolter, and of Premediation, a book about effect and mediality after 9/11. And of course, we included an translation of your article, Richard, about evil mediation for our book, and that would be maybe our first point to talk about today. Evil, you don't mean it in a moral sense, as Fuller and Goffey also put it, but you say evil mediation is a new kind of understanding of media and mediation in an infrastructural sense or in an effective sense. Maybe you could talk a bit about this term.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for interviewing me, and thanks for including the translation in the book. Yeah, evil mediation, and as it is drawn from the book called Evil Media by Matthew Fuller and Andrew Goffey. And obviously evil is a weighted term, right? Because its primary meaning does fall into a moral register of good versus evil. And I think they and I want that kind of sort of aura that around the term. But what evil refers to in a moral sense, I think, is individual human intent, individual human agency, a determination by a person to do something wrong, essentially, or something bad. And what the argument of evil media is for them, and what I developed further in relation, more specifically, I would say, in relation to Trump, is to focus on what they call gray media, on things that happen, that media do independent of human agency or human intent. Media can get set up, but once systems are in place, they have their own kind of agency or their own autonomy, and that operate without humans having to intervene at every step. Obviously, there's always human agency involved in setting things up. And so with Trump and the evil mediation argument, what I was trying to think about is, why was it that here was this, buffoon, this obviously, sorry about the random noises on the computer, this person who is clearly unqualified to be the president of, the most powerful nation in the world, and somebody who's, had behaved in his private life really poorly, somebody whose businesses were clearly not as successful as they had been, someone who had no government experience, knew nothing about foreign affairs, about the workings of the state. How could this person, and then, get elected president? And then over the course of the campaign, as one horrible, story comes out after another, all of these kinds of news stories that would have, in a prior presidential election, it would have just been grounds, that would have ended his campaign. None of this stuck. And I was just curious why there was this, and how he was able to get elected, even first nominated, despite the fact that if people rationally debated his qualifications, his positions, and so forth, you could see that people were just dismissive, or you could see he wasn't qualified. And what became clear to me is that what made it happen for Trump was the way in which mediation of Trump, some initiated by him, some by the media, some by outside agents, the way in which that mediation had started to operate almost on its own to just take up all of the media space and all of the air in the room. And so I came across this really wonderful quotation from Felix Guattari from the late 20th century, actually about the early 90s, I think it was, about Trump as a real estate developer. And where he described him, first of all, talked about him in relation to television, but described him as a species of algae as a real estate developer who just crowded out all the nutrients in any kind of space. We'd buy up a block of property and just crowd people out so there was nowhere for them to breathe and so forth. And this was about how his buildings, he would evict poor people. He'd buy buildings in poor neighborhoods and they would become evicted and then he would redevelop them. But that metaphor of the algae, which mindlessly reproduces, it's not an intentional act of reproduction, but which mindlessly reproduces, struck me as being a really appropriate metaphor for how mediation reproduced. So that when Trump tweeted or when he gave a press conference or when he said anything, that would be picked up by other Twitter feeds, then by the cable news media, by newspapers, and all of those, because everybody is online, would be shared, retweeted, commented on, and so forth. And so it was just all Trump all the time. And I believe that's how he won the Republican nomination. Nobody else could just even get any airtime. And also with Hillary Clinton, he just crowded her out. Even though the stories were negative, the content and meaning of the stories were critical and against him, those stories, I argued, performed their own work, their own evil, in a sense, by reproducing and not allowing for anybody else to have as much time, and also for making it seem perfectly normal for Trump to be a president. People talked about him, even in criticizing him, about what would a Trump presidency look like and things like that. And so the media, despite, and this has continued right through his presidency, although it's changed a little bit, but not a whole lot. The media has been critical of him the whole time, but they still cover him. Almost every story is about Trump. And it's happening now with Trump and Biden as well, and which makes me a little nervous about this election.
You've been referring in Trump's evil mediation to this concept of premediation,
Right.
which is important for your work. And I was wondering if there is some difference between the premediation of the media of the Trump presidency in 2016 and the now ongoing premediation of Trump. I mean, one very important concept in premediation is that the media install a low level of fear so that people can anticipate things no longer unanticipated.
Yes.
And I have the impression that there is a difference between this accidental premediation of the Trump presidency through that media infrastructure of evil media in 2016 and today's premediation, which is kind of installing more something like high level of fear. And I'm not sure whether this is productive.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that, I think premediation, I think as you suggest, was operative in 2016, 15 and 16 and has remained operative. But yes, the level of fear and intensity has really changed. In 2016, it operated in things like, what would a Trump presidency look like? You would see an article like that. Or what would the first 100 days of a Trump presidency be? And the effect that that had was, and like I said, the content of those were often kind of terrifying, but the effect it had from people reading it was to let them imagine a Trump presidency as being possible. And in a way, preparing them effectively for when it happened, although it was pretty much of a shock when he was elected. I mean, I'm not sure how well they prepared him, because the other form of premediation that was happening was the polls. And the polls all said Clinton's got a huge lead, there's no way Trump can win, and so forth. So I think that was where 2016 provided us with a shock, similar on a much smaller scale, of course, but similar to 9/11. The way the premediation has been happening, especially for this election, is in regard, and in the last couple of weeks, this has really intensified, in regard to the question of will Trump leave office if he's voted out? Will he accept the results of the election? What will he do to prevent that or to stop that? And all of these articles are meant to warn us, right? Prepare us. Look, and there's one powerful article in The Atlantic that came out about a week ago that talks about the legal and quasi-legal means that Trump can use to stay in office. And this is about him sowing so much chaos that, there's just this sense that we can't even know what the results are. Yeah, because, what people have predicted, right, or not predicted, what they've premeditated is election night, Trump possibly having a lead, because one of the arguments is that Trump voters will vote more in person because they're not so worried about COVID and the pandemic, and they don't feel it's a real threat. It's fake news. Whereas Democratic supporters, many of them will vote by mail or absentee ballot because they're concerned about standing in long lines to vote, especially because the voter suppression efforts by the Republicans make it so that in Democratic districts, especially ones with lots of Black voters, they have very few polling places. And so you have to stand in line for hours to vote. Whereas if you live in a white, wealthy suburb, you can walk in and in 15 minutes, you're done. So that's another of the ways that Trump and the Republicans are, trying to rig this election. But the article assumes that there certainly won't be a definitive result on election night, as there often is, because there will be so many absentee ballots that haven't come in yet. There's so many uncounted ballots. And therefore, Fox News might call the election for Trump, but presumably the other more, quote, liberal news media might say, no, we can't call it yet, it's too close. And then Trump will start, and his supporters will start claiming, I won, what's going on, the fake news media and so forth. And then if you imagine that, let's say all these absent and mail-in votes come in over the course of the next several days, and then what looked like a Trump victory turns out to be a Biden victory, Trump will say, see, it's rigged, it's fixed, it's cheating. And he's going to create so much chaos that, these are the speculations, that this could then send it to the court. There will be legal challenges. There will be, any number of crazy things. So the premediation now is scaring people about Trump stealing the election, even if he loses. It's meant to warn people and to prepare us. That's the sort of latent content of it, the semantic meaning of those articles. But I'm afraid that the affective force of those articles is going to be to make it seem as if this is a legitimate possibility. And because this Atlantic article, which is terrifying, really, none of the things they're talking about him doing are illegal. They're talking about him rigging the system. And there's one way is appealing to the Supreme Court to stop voting or not counting certain votes. Another way is, we have this crazy electoral college system, and where the people don't elect the president. The electors who are appointed by every state are the ones who vote. Well, on December 8th, the states have to appoint their electors. The Constitution says that the legislature of each state determines how its electors will be selected. Historically, it's always been based upon who won the popular vote in the state. But it doesn't have to be that way. It's legal for a state to say, these results are not legitimate. It's, all the confusion and chaos that Trump suggests. They can say these results aren't legitimate. We're not going to accept those to select our electors. We are going to vote ourselves. And if a state is controlled by a Republican legislature and Republican governor, they can appoint Trump-friendly electors, so that a state that the people might vote 52% Biden, 48% Trump, that state could appoint all of its electoral college votes to be for Trump. And this is another way he could legally, not ethically, not morally, legally steal the election. Anyway, it's a terrifying article, but you're right. The premediation, to return to your question, is operating at a much different kind of level right now. But I still feel it is operating in a way to get people to at least think, first of all, that it's plausible that something could be pulled off, but also to have the affective feelings of, oh my God, what if this happened? And the thing is, it's really shocking now to think about it, but if you are shocked over and over by something, eventually the effect starts to diminish and you start to get numb, so that when it does happen, there won't be anything to stop it. There won't be as much, I think, outrage in a sense. So this is my fear, one of my many fears about what's happening.
We could ask a lot of things in now, but one of the ideas of the book is that you cannot understand Trump as a phenomenon in whatever way if you don't understand television, and not only its representational logic, but all its mediational logics of television, because it made Trump great and it made Trump popular, and it made Trump the person and maybe also the president he is now. So what kind of role do you think does television play in these forms of premediation, in these forms of evil mediation or total mediation? Because we all know that television is kind of a declining medium, but also it still plays an interesting role. How would you answer to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Television is really crucial for Trump. I think he has always seen himself, even with the obsessive tweeting he does, sees himself as a television star, right? Off of The Apprentice show and so forth, and talking about ratings all the time. And he watches Fox News and retweets it regularly. I mean, live tweeting practically Fox News. So two things to say. First, yes, television is still crucial. All media now, right, are interrelated. So where there once was thought about medium specificity, and there still are some people who want to hold on to some aspects of that. And I agree that there are some differences. I don't think we want to make every medium the same. They're so interrelated. What television started doing, I saw in the Egyptian Spring, and that spring of revolts that happened in the Mideast, starting in Egypt in the Arab Spring, was television started at that moment covering Twitter. So what they were because it was really hard, for one thing, in the US, for US television to get live reporting for what was going on in Egypt and the other countries around North Africa, around the Mediterranean there, where these revolts were happening, these popular rebellions. And so they covered it via tweets. So what would happen, they'd go to a commercial break and they would say, coming up after commercial, the newest tweets from Libya, the newest tweets from Egypt. And then they would just scroll these tweets. And so from that moment, television really became one of its objects of coverage for television news was Twitter, was the Twitter stream. And I think media now cover media as much as they cover, non-media, if there is any non-media anymore. I mean, so television has been crucial in amplifying those things, but there still is the power of the immediacy of television that we talk about in remediation. So when they cable news channels cover live Trump's press conferences or cover his rallies, unfortunately, they've been diminishing all of that. But when they cover it live, the immediacy of Trump on screen speaking to us has a power that I think is affectively certainly greater than the power of, even a Twitter thread, but the tweets are so much more numerous that all those little affective sort of zings and impacts have their own collective power. So you see this kind of hypermediation of Twitter versus the immediacy of television. So it is still crucial. Trump, in a piece that I've published, I mean, it's a longer argument I'm working on, but part of it is in a book edited, Anna, by a couple of your colleagues from a conference we did following the time I spent in Tübingen in 2017. I argued that we need to think about Trump. One way to think about Trump is in relation to the film The Truman Show. And I start thinking about the Trump Show as a moniker to think about how Trump is trying, like Truman, like the Truman Show was, not that Truman tried, he was unwitting, to be, covered live 24/7, which the Truman Show was, if you remember this film about following this from a baby that they followed and made this young man, Jim Carrey plays him as an adult, made him the subject of nonstop television show, and it was a global phenomenon. The Trump Show is just like the Truman Show, except it's not just television. It's television, it's Twitter, it's Facebook, it's Snapchat, it's the various right-wing social media sites, Reddit, so forth. So it is television, but it's an expanded television. It's a total mediation in the way that, we talked about expanded or total cinema in the 60s. We now have expanded or total television in the 21st century, where television is not just confined to a screen, but it brings together, in a sense, all of the media into one, which is the total mediation argument that I'm making in relation to the Trump Show. That for Trump, we have a kind of Gesamtvermittlung, a total mediation that is parallel to sort of what Wagner talked about with his total work of art. And the idea is that, like the opera or something, which brought together all these different art forms, Trump and his mediation, his political mediation, brings together all of these different media forms. But television, I do believe, is still in some ways affectively central.
At the end of Trump's evil mediation, you were referring to this concept of a counter-evil mediation. Since you have no possibility to have the media infrastructure to have no effects, you have to use it to have better effects on the society, to promote resistance and things like that. Do you see that there was some kind of successful counter-evil mediation in the media and in television in the last 3-4 years?
Well, ask me this after the election is resolved, which might be in January of next year, who knows? But I think there have been efforts. I think that so there's two ways, again, to counter it. So one is to counter Trump's mediation, his evil mediation, with other forms of media, other mediations that criticize him and that offer, look, he was lying, look, he's inconsistent, all of this kind of thing. But none of that has any effect on public opinion. People who already don't like Trump know that, and people who do like Trump dismiss it. And I think, actually, as I've said, it has often the opposite effect. It just keeps Trump in, on our screens. Because if Trump loses, there's going to be a lot of melancholy and loss, even among people who hate him, because there is this figure who has occupied our media sphere, our media imagination now for almost 5 years. And sure, we hate him, but we hate a lot of evil characters in television series, in Dallas or shows like that. There are characters we love to hate. And when Trump is no longer there, there's going to be this gap. And I think people are going to feel, this is not an argument to keep it, but people are going to feel, I think, a sort of a loss, because everybody's been able to define themselves against Trump. So there was at the beginning this, and it really boosted now from a corporate point of view, media ratings have been boosted by Trump because people want the latest news, whether they love him or hate him. So at the beginning, the media was just covering him like any other president. If he had a press conference, they covered it. If he had a rally, they covered it. When he had a Twitter, he would tweet, and they would interpret a tweet as if it was an official presidential statement. And so, Trump tweeted this, da, da, da. They thought they were countering him, but they weren't. They were making him a larger than life figure, and I think actually inflating him. What they've started to do over the past year and more is not cover everything and cut him off in the middle. When he was doing these COVID, I was worried about the COVID briefings at the beginning because I was afraid that he was going to be then, because he was on television every day, he was taking the narrative back. Because there was a time, especially with impeachment, where Trump had been moved to the side a bit. I mean, it was about Trump, but you weren't seeing him. You were seeing other people. And I was afraid the COVID narration was going to bring him back, but he was so horrendous. He bungled this so horribly that and lied so incessantly that the media finally decided we're not covering every 2-hour stream of consciousness COVID briefing. And then he cut them off. He stopped doing them because the media stopped covering them. So that's where counter-mediation has worked best to me, is to cut Trump off, and not, because having him on screen, no matter what the content of your message is, works, I think, in his favor. Until or unless the public just gets bored with him, and they haven't yet. I think that the better counter-mediation strategy would be to create new futures and to imagine new possibilities, to talk much more about what the world will look like, what would the world look like after Trump, and start creating this kind of positive mediations of, universal health care, racial justice, climate action, peacefulness and cooperation with our friends and allies in Europe and elsewhere across the world. In other words, a mediation that was not about Trump, but that was about imagining a future that without him, that would be a desirable future, and to make that something that people wanted to bring about. And this is what some people are worried about with the Biden campaign, because right now it is still focusing on not Trump, not exclusively. And it's different from 4 years ago because people have seen what a Trump presidency is. 4 years ago, the media still said, they kept saying, you might remember, when will he act presidential? Or that was the first speech he gave where Trump really was presidential. And it was just such BS, as we said. It was just, they kept imagining he would turn into something that he's incapable of turning into. So counter-mediation, I think, is beginning to work. But it really, what the real counter-mediation is going to be is the mediation at the polls. And to make sure those votes get counted, to make sure that the people who want to vote get to vote, and so forth. Because voting is, a long-standing form of mediation in our country and really in democracies in general. We don't often think about voting as media, but they really are. And if you remember in 2000 with the George W. Bush Al Gore election, which was similarly sent to the Supreme Court, well, not similarly, I'm hoping, but which was sent to the Supreme Court in 2000, it hinged very much on what they called these hanging chads, on these paper ballots that people punched through, but the little piece of paper didn't disconnect. And so it was still attached to the ballot. And so it was like, well, is this really a vote? And so the paper mediation was so important there that that voting was a technology of mediation that we had never thought about. We had just erased it and made it invisible. It was all about who you voted for. But all of a sudden in 2000, we realized that there was this mediation going on, this complex series of mediations that had been invisible to us, had been transparent. And so voting became hyper-mediated in 2000 in that way. So that's still going to be, that's an issue now, even more blown up because of Trump.
Okay, one last question, short question. One of the high marks of our book, Trump and Television, have been your poems. You've been editing from the utterances of Trump, from his poetic utterances.
Yeah.
Will you use him as a poet, giving you material to make your own poems after he's lost, possibly lost the election?
My poems or more Trump poems? Which one are you asking?
I mean, the Trump poems.
Will I make more poems of Trump?
Will you make more poems?
Yeah, I made one recently that was one of his crazy things. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I made them because I don't actually even know why. I just started listening to these things and they were so ludicrous. And I just sort of started playing with them. And, you know, in terms of the methodology, there's not a word removed. I mean, there are people who've done some similar things, but what I did was took a chunk from some speech he made or some, you know, news conference where he's talking and started here, ended here, and just rearranged the words. I mean, the punctuation and capitalization and line breaks were what I added, because you're speaking, there is no real, especially when he speaks, there is no punctuation to speak of. But yeah, they're not, things aren't rearranged. There are no ellipses. It's just his words. And what I noticed was he does speak in certain kinds of, there are some speech patterns that lend themselves, some talking in threes or some balancing, you know, parallelisms, like if this and this. And so that's why, I don't know, I just felt like I had to write them. I don't know if I will continue. I've really, to be honest, I'm not even, I was supposed to write, University of Minnesota Press wanted me to write a little book on Trump that would have come out this fall, thinking about it for people teaching the election. And for a variety of mostly personal reasons, I didn't have the time to finish it. And then I decided I wanted to tell the story when the 4 years were over. I wanted it to be a complete story, not write it in the middle of the third year. I mean, this was before impeachment even happened. And so I'm glad I didn't, and I am still considering finishing that, you know, which would be, there's parts, about half it's done, finishing it after the election when I see what happened. But there's another part of me that is so tired of him and so disheartened and so disgusted that I'm just not even certain that I want to spend my time thinking about him, even if it's a kind of critical and also an illustrative kind of thing, because there's been a million books on Trump, it seems like, and most of them, unlike your collection, most of them focus on content and on what happened. And there are a few collections now focusing on Trump and media. But still, what I've really tried to underscore is the materiality of mediation, how it operates, how media, yes, carry messages, and that's a part of it. But I wanted to isolate this other part of it, which is just the physical materiality and the affective force they have, independent of anything. And the affective force Trump's mediation has had on me is really a kind of just deadness or disdain. I really wish I could just go to sleep and wake up whenever this election was decided, so I would at least know. If Trump is around another 4 years, and I don't know that I can actually remain living in this country. I just have a hard time thinking about that. So Tübingen was really a lovely place to be. So I'll have to give some thought to that. But the world will be really grateful, as well as the United States, if in fact this nightmare ends. So, and maybe I'll write a poem, we'll see.
Thanks a lot. I have always been wondering, for us as scholars as well, if we also contribute to the obsession about Trump, if we
No.
teach Trump and if we write books about Trump. So the minor decision that we made is not to include a picture of him on the cover. That was part of it, but maybe we also would be relieved in a way not to talk and write and think about him anymore, and instead focus on other issues.
Absolutely. I do think I've thought about that too, but I feel as if our influence, our sphere of influence is much smaller than the sphere of influence of Twitter, Facebook, mainstream media, television media, and so forth. And our audience tends to be already much more critical. So I do feel as if we aren't contributing so much to that. But there is clearly an element in which, one does have to think about it. If you had put pictures, I think Der Spiegel has been brilliant in its images of Trump, and I've got a bunch of them saved on my computer. At one point, I was contemplating a Trump's Faces kind of piece, a visual kind of piece, because he himself has such a variety of really horrid looking faces, but I've got a lot of the Der Spiegel covers. They've really done a great job. So that wouldn't have been the most horrible kind of place to use one, but I think your decision was a good one not to do it. So thanks.
Thanks a lot.
And thanks for doing the book, both of you.
And good luck.
Yeah, thanks. We could talk later after this is done, the election, I mean.